Today's discussion is on something called the egoic mind, which is an important concept to understand for Eastern philosophy. Who in here at times is actually tortured by your own mind, the repetitive negative thoughts? Dave Matthews has a song that says, "I just want my mind to leave my mind alone." The idea we wake up and from the beginning of the morning till the end of night, we're just sort of jackhammered by our repetitive thoughts. And I'm sure some of you take things personally and get bitter when you've been wronged by others. Eastern philosophy says if this is true, and in most cases it is true, it's because you've been fooled by the illusion of the egoic mind. So what is the egoic mind? The ego is not what we mean in the traditional Western sense. If I say you have a big ego, I'm saying you're cocky, you're full of yourself. That's not what we're talking about. It has a different meaning in Eastern philosophy. In Eastern philosophy, the idea of ego is identifying with your thoughts so much that you think that's who you really are. You think you are your thoughts. The idea of dreams, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. The ego is not who you really are. The ego is your self-image. It's your social mask. It's the role you are playing. Your social mask will thrive on approval from others. It wants control. It is sustained and kept in power by power because it always lives in fear. This is Deepak Chopra. He's a modern Eastern philosopher, so to speak. So most Eastern philosophies believe, simply put, that you are not your thoughts. So to understand this, let's examine a timeline of how you became who you are. We're going to walk you through this step because it's kind of a heavy-duty concept. So we're going to break down the sentence, how you became who you are. The first you, how you became who you are. The first you in Eastern philosophy is the awareness, your soul, your life force. The Taoists call it the uncarved block. In other words, as a small child and you began to take in the world, that was the real you. The uncarved block meaning society has not yet turned you into something else. So as we break down this sentence, the first you, which is the uncarved block, it was, since the beginning of your time, it's been conditioned by family, society, media, friends, etc., concerning what brought more of what it wanted the most, which is love and attention. As a child, you do something and mom smiles or dad holds you, and you're going to do more of it. You want that love and attention. The second you is the ego that was created by the first you, meaning the uncarved block. And that second you, you've developed this ego by interacting with society. It's where all of your thoughts come from. If you had a tragic upbringing and your mother always said negative things to you and I should never have had you or blah, 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 you are naturally going to develop a negative mindset, which is the mind itself. That second you, your ego, is going to have low self-esteem because of the interaction it had with society, meaning specifically the parent in that example. So what your ego is, in the Eastern concept is, your ego is going to contain all of the concepts that you really identify with. Your likes, your opinions, your dislikes, your resentments, your concepts or stories you have in your head if you're a success or failure. These are your ego, and these are built by you interacting with society since your birth. Now, your thinking is going to be conditioned by the past. That's very clear. And what the ego becomes is your thoughts, a bundle of memories that we call me and my story. This is where your thoughts are going to emanate from, this ego that was created. So most people, and by the way, a lot of this is from Eckhart Tolle, who's sort of a modern philosopher, if you will, who deals with concepts like this. You identify with your thinking, and the identification with the thinking becomes your ego, which means that you believe every thought that arises. Thoughts are going to bubble up all day long, and rather than letting them come and go, we tend to think that's who we are. You're going to derive your sense of who you are and your self-esteem from what your mind is telling you are. It's a vicious circle. If your ego has been made negative in terms of a mindset, it's going to keep sending out negative thoughts, which is going to keep you in a negative place. The mind that perceives the limitation is the limitation. which means as soon as you say, I can't do it, well, that's the barrier to your own potential moving forward. The mind that sees the limitation creates the limitation. If you think you can't, you're right. There are kids who will say, I can't meditate, Mr. Wilcox. You don't understand. I can't do mindfulness. My mind's out of control. If you think you can't, you're right. Because that mind is limiting you. That negative mindset. So if you can shed or at least minimize the egoic mind, or at least see it as it comes out in you all day long, you will have more peace of mind. And when you have more peace of mind, you'll have a little more mind control, which sounds really cool, but all it simply is you have better control of how your thoughts are operating. It's an illusion that you've been living in that your mind is you. That sounds bizarre to say, but we're going to get into it a little bit more. Rule your mind or it will rule you. Now, the concept is if you have a mind, then obviously you can control it. But most of the people won't be able to. They'll try to control everything else in the universe, everybody else's actions and what life does, and they won't control the one thing they do have control over, which is our mindset. Probably the biggest subconscious story, meaning a story that we're not always aware we're telling ourselves, that the ego keeps spewing out, is more than or less than. We're more than or less than everyone else because we have been conditioned in school, growing up, being compared to your siblings. We've been conditioned to find our true value and our self-esteem through only comparing ourselves to others. So that's why people love winning things. You love success. You got a 92 in the test and you're so excited. What's the first thing you do? You look and see how everybody else did on the test because you need to be better than them. Subconscious meaning it makes you feel good because you won. And the concept is over time, everybody needs this in America. So what do? Rather than fixing the problem that you don't need to be a more than or less than, we now give everybody a trophy so everybody feels special until people realize that everybody gets a trophy and you're the same as everybody else. So therefore, it doesn't do what we design it to do. Your appearances, your skills, your possessions, everything about you, you compare it subconsciously to others. You walk down this hallway and you see the pretty girl and you're not as pretty. Subconsciously, you feel kind of crappy about yourself. Maybe you dislike that girl for being better looking. And then as you walk by, you see somebody else who is maybe, quote unquote, more pathetic than you. And that person makes you subconsciously feel a little bit better in the more than or less than mindset. We watched the other day the episode of Broken Mirror, the episode of Nosedive. And some kids always say, oh my God, I'd hate to live in a world that's just surrounded around your rankings. Well, guess what? We do. And it's because people buy into this whole concept of how many likes did I get or how many friend requests or whatever it might be. In the movie, at the very end, Lacey and the other prisoner, they are free, even though they're in jail. And how are they free? They are free because they are no longer worrying about the whole social status game, and now they can live. Now, Lacey wanted to be a more than so bad, and then when she couldn't, you watched her spiraling so bad that she is basically at a low level. Now, if you remember the truck driver, Lacey sheds that tight shoe of allowing others to dictate how we feel about ourselves. And when you kind of get rid of that tight shoe and you can be yourself like the truck driver, you can be free in that way and no longer have everybody else determine your happiness by how you think you rate against them. The episode tries to use satire to get you to see that through new eyes that this is the life that most of us live. It's not a future world. It's a day-to-day ruler that we use to see how we rank with each other. And as a result, most people have low self-esteem. So this comparing is how we've been conditioned to measure our value. It's a wrong and unhealthy. It starts in school. It really obscures who we really are. And it leaves us most of the time with a not enough. And we need to be better. We need to make something of ourselves. In the future, we're going to be happy when we do X, Y, and Z. But the concept is when we're thinking about this imaginary better future rather than the present moment, we make ourselves feel better in the present moment, but when that imaginary future comes, is it what we expected it to be? A flower does not think of competing with the flower next to it, it just blooms. The idea, and I mean, one of the reasons I'm sort of negative about the school system is the rank and file, class rank. You're great and you're bad. That's not true. School measures memory. It doesn't measure a lot of other things like emotional intelligence, creativity, things like that. So this more than or less than thinking, and I'm going to keep coming back to it because it's going to take a few knocks on the brain to kind of get this. It gives us the cocky pride. Now, whether or not we're cocky or whether or not we just feel good about ourselves, when we win, when we're the best, we feel great. When we get a 96, we feel awesome. We're not necessarily taunting others, but we feel as though we've done it. We have success. And conversely, it gives us insecurity about the fear that we're not going to be enough. I'm not as smart as them, or I'm not as good looking at them, or whatever it is. It's really sad because a lot of times people end up accomplishing things just to try to prove somebody wrong. Because if you prove somebody else wrong, then that makes you right. And the egoic mind is strong. One of the things I find so interesting in class as the year goes on, a lot of kids want to find an exception to the rule and kind of fight against different concepts, which is fine. You don't ever have to agree with everything I say. But the idea of the ego, if you can find one exception that 1% of the time the rule's not true, you feel good. But you obscure the fact that maybe the other 99% of the time it's true. We have this need to be right because it builds our ego stronger. I put this slide up earlier in the year, and I'm not going to read it out loud, but the idea, our self-esteem usually is we're at a low place until every once in a while we kind of feel strong. And we search for that success just to make us have some self-esteem and value. So the bottom line is this. Your self-image, who you think you are, really at a deep level, and most people, not everybody, it depends on other people who have less, can do less, and know less. Because if there's other people that you're better than, you will feel better about yourself. And that's what makes the ego what it is. The ego feels bad when somebody else knows more than you. The ego feels bad when it doesn't get attention. The ego wants to be the center of attention because that's what it feeds upon. It needs to know and be better than others because that's what makes it powerful. So here's a story. This is an episode of a TV show called Wicked Tuna. On the top left, you see the two guys. The captain's on the right. The guy on the left is his assistant. You notice on the bottom right, the captain's also a pilot. So he owns a boat. He's the captain of the tuna fishing boat, and he also is a pilot on an airline. He's doing pretty well. The guy on the left, he's just the first mate. Well, the captain of the boat went away to fly on the airline, and while he was away, the first mate was in charge, and the first mate caught like 4 fish, each fish worth like $7,000, $8,000. That's a lot more fish than normally the captain on the right would catch. Now, the thing that's interesting is all of the fish that are caught, the profits go to the captain on the right, even though he wasn't there. So when he returned and found out that his first mate had done really well and caught a lot of fish and made him, $40,000, $50,000, you would expect him to be happy. But he wasn't. Why was he not happy? How come he's thinking subconsciously? How come he was able to catch fish and I wasn't? In other words, when other captains said, hey, you should leave the boat more often, you'll catch more fish, those words hurt him because in his mind, he perceived that others were thinking that the guy on the left, the first mate, was more successful than him. Even though he made the profit, even though he owns the boat, even though he's a pilot, and the other guy's making a little more than minimum wage, just the belief that someone was better than him in this 1 week of fishing was enough to send him into an emotional tailspin in an episode. The ego is always striving and struggling to survive. It always protects itself. It is an armor that we develop in life, and it always tries to enlarge itself as well. So how does it do this? Complaining is one of the ego's best ways to deal with life. A lot of people just get stuck in this compulsive complaining thing, and it strengthens itself. Every time you complain about something, it's a story where your mind is saying, I don't like this, I criticize this. And by criticizing whatever happens, it makes you feel a little bigger, more superior. The best example is if you're at the grocery store or the bank and you're behind somebody who's paying with pennies and they're taking forever and you're in that line and you're obviously annoyed that this person is paying with nickels and dimes and pennies. And sometimes, if you actually notice, the people will show a kind of a grumpy look on their face, like, what the hell, this is ridiculous. And then you'll look at the people in the line, look at each other, and kind of have this, like, acknowledgement, like, Just with facially, like, oh, what's this person doing? And then we feel good because we have condemned a thing that's bad that we don't like, and the ego is still superior. Every time you complain, you make yourself a victim. You either leave the situation, change the situation, or accept it. All else is madness. What most people do is they complain. And by saying that this is wrong, we are saying that we are right, and the ego is fed. Some egos, unfortunately, have nothing left to do in their life but complain all of the time. That's what they are powered by. Unfortunately, you'll see people later in life, because life doesn't always go our way, they get stuck in this cycle of just complaining about everything. The old episode of The Simpsons with the grandpa saying, the nurses are stealing my money. The way that people use complaining, we feel better about ourselves because we're right and the situation about life is wrong. And blah, 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 and the ego gets stronger, but we suffer because we're not accepting what is. Would you rather be right or would you rather be free? A lot of people engage in arguing as a way to help their own self-esteem. They can win the argument, they can feel good that they won, or they can at least try to force the other person to accept their viewpoint or hear their viewpoint, and then they feel affirmation, they feel a pat on the head. Or you could just be free to let other people believe what they want and be happy with yourself. But most people aren't happy about themselves. That's why they have to win arguments, and that's why they won't admit that they're losing an argument. They're not protecting the viewpoint they're holding, they're protecting their own ego. People with an over-attachment to ego always need attention. They're the ones who have to, finish. As soon as you finish your story, they have to tell their version of the story. They make themselves feel more complete by building up their ego, by being a more than. And that's ultimately how we pull ourselves up. We always need the pat on the head. So if you tell the story, I'm going to one-up you. I'm not listening to your story. I'm waiting to talk because my ego feels left out. But listen to my version of what happened to me. That's the ego flailing for somebody to give it attention. Getting that pat on the head from others is what most people need. So if you want to complain to me about all your problems and I say, wow, that sucks, I understand how you feel so badly, that makes you feel good because somebody else agrees with your ego. It doesn't fix the problem. Resentment is another thing that the ego uses to add emotion, to add energy to itself. We become offended by what others have done, and what they failed to do, and what they should or shouldn't do. These are all opinions we have, and the ego says, this is wrong, I am right. And in that way, it powers itself. You feel personally wrong, and you need to get the last word. That's the idea of the ego needing to be one up, needing to be a more than. So the egos need to feel superior. Here's other examples so that you can see it. Gossiping. Guess what? You don't know? Let me tell you. Oh, this is the perfect thing for the ego. Because when you gossip, you know more than the person you're telling them. Like hey, I got to tell you something you don't know. You feel good about that. And at the same time, gossiping is usually negative. You're bringing somebody else down. This is sort of like in two ways the ego feels better. The ego needs drama and it needs conflict. And that's what it wants all of the time. It strengthens itself through the drama and conflict. Name dropping is another one. And I actually still do this, but when you're telling a story and all of a sudden you say, and my cousin was on the movie whatever. Well, why is that in the story? Subconsciously, we want the other person to say, oh, wow, that's your cousin? That's so impressive. Well, who cares? Why are you trying to impress the other person with someone who's related to you or someone you know, etc., etc.? And as I said, the need to win an argument is more about me being right so that the ego feels good. Recognize when your mind becomes stuck in its own self-created drama, because that's what the ego does. It creates drama to feel powerful. The many so-called personal problems you perceive are merely dreams of the mind caused by a relationship problem between you and your thoughts. And that's what today's discussion is trying to correct. When you learn to ignore the overthinking, the analyzing egoic mind, life will become happier, more joyful, less stressful, and more carefree. So, why do you think these specific thoughts that make up your ego? They're your conditioning. You've been taught certain things, you've heard certain things. Somebody at some time said your left ear is bigger than your right. And now that concept is stuck in your head. It's not going to go away. There will always be thoughts that are going to bubble up and tell you about your left ear, your self-esteem, or you're a less than. The more you believe these thoughts, the more they become stuck in their mind and they become repetitive. It's like imagine if you had a best friend and all day long they just tapped you on the shoulder and reminded you of all of your dislikes and insecurities. You wouldn't have that person as a best friend. Well, guess what? That's your mind in most cases. It gets us stuck. We have selective perception when this occurs. We hear the negative and we add it to chapter number 187 of woe is me, I'm a victim, bad things happen to me. We reinforce the stories of the ego. We might miss the good things. That's what selective perception means. We only perceive the things that add to our own self-belief. And it's the self-belief of the mind, the egoic mind, which is unfortunately so toxic. There is no need to be more. You are enough. Everybody is enough. A lot of kids have problems when I'm talking about the egoic mind, and they're like, well, shouldn't you feel good about yourself and have self-esteem? You should, obviously. You need to be happy about yourself as a person. You should try to do your best. You should try to have success. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not saying don't have goals, but it's saying you don't need to compare yourself. You don't need to be validated by everybody else. You don't need to do this accomplishment out of fear that you're not going to be enough. Unfortunately, kids will now argue with me, but the fear motivates me to achieve. If you think deep down that being afraid your whole life is the only way to motivate yourself, that's a sad story to me. Eastern philosophy realizes you don't need to validate yourself. The ego is an illusion that has been created by your conditioning. And hopefully today's discussion is to begin to crack the sort of ego so you can see beyond it. We're often going to fail at a lot of things we try in our lifetimes. Over time, everything is going to change. Your looks are going to change. Your abilities are going to change. Suffering is going to occur if you think that you are simply your looks and your abilities. If our self-worth is just based on what we look like or our skills, it's a dangerous ruler, and I mean that two different ways. Ruler in that we're measuring ourselves by something that's pointless, and we are also using it to rule our lives. Now, somebody will say, I have to beat the other person to get the job. Agreed. I agree with that. There are times that competition is real, but a lot of times it's not. And the ego thrives on the comparison, unfortunately, to the degree it makes us negative. So, how do you minimize your ego and have a more content life? Well, the freedom from your ego, and this is from Eckhart Tolle, is when, and this is important, so pay attention, when you realize that there have been certain thoughts that have been going through your head for years, the same repetitive thoughts. Probably 70% of your thoughts are the same thoughts. They are only thoughts. They are bubbling up from your ego. You are not your thought. You are the awareness. You're the one who's observing the thoughts. So in other words, if a negative thought comes in my mind, I think of it as an opinion. An opinion I've heard probably for the last 35 years of my life. And when that negative thought comes like a shooting star into my mind while I'm trying to make grilled cheese sandwich, instead of saying, oh, here you are, negative thought, let's talk to you for the next 3 hours and try to fix the problem I've never fixed or feel bad about myself. Instead, when that negative thought shows up, I'm the awareness that sees the repetition of the thought, and I say something like, oh, hello again. Thank you for your advice. And I let it go. I know what it's saying. Your thought is just an opinion. You do not have to be tied to every thought. The moment you become aware of the ego in you, strictly speaking, it's no longer the ego. It becomes an old conditioned mind pattern. Ego implies unawareness. As soon as you have awareness, the ego can no longer exist. And so the key is you are the awareness. So we're going to get into what that means. Awareness means, if you remember that your thoughts are thought patterns that are conditioned, it's not who you really are. The awareness is hopefully developing some space between you and your thoughts, becoming the witness of what you're thinking, and not letting it rule you, but just hearing it as a repetitive thought pattern that's telling you the same thing it's always told you. It does not need to be listened to. Once your awareness becomes a flame, it will burn up the whole slavery that the mind has created, slavery to our thoughts. So the thoughts and the stories that your ego is made up, because your ego is who you think you are, if you manage to be aware of these thoughts, The awareness is really who you are. You're not your thoughts, you're the awareness. You're the watcher of the thought. You're the observer of the thought. So here's an example that might make sense. Everybody has dreams, and I'm sure from time to time you are surprised by a dream. You're thinking, why the hell did I dream that? Most people have been surprised by your dream. Now, why are you surprised by your dream? Your dream is coming from your subconscious mind, your mindset, which is your ego. And all you are the one who is watching the dream. You're the one observing the dream. Just like you're the one who's observing your thoughts. But we don't believe dreams necessarily when we wake up. Unfortunately, we believe our egoic thoughts forever. When one is depressed, the witness allows us to see, oh wow, there is depression in me. And the part that recognizes it isn't actually depressed. You just observe your emotional state, and the witness that is doing the observing isn't part of the emotional state. In this way, you can get better control of your thoughts and emotions by creating separation between just being 100% anger. If you could become 90% anger and 10% that sees that you're angry and analyzes why you're angry, as soon as you see the way the mind works, the egoic mind starts to lose its power. So, see if you can catch the voice in your head the very moment it begins to complain about something, and recognize what it is. It's your ego. It's no more than a conditioned mind pattern. Thoughts aren't real unless we make them real through our actions. Whenever you notice that little voice, you're going to realize that you're not the voice, but you're the one who's aware of the voice. It's going to be really easy when you talk to your friends to see the egoic mind in others and how they're always trying to, through their discussion, to make you think they're better than they are. That's just what we do. It's unfortunate. The more you're aware of it, the more you can see it. Now, when you become aware of it in yourself, try not to be judgmental. It's a conditioned thought pattern for the last 17, 18 years. In the background, always, there is the awareness, the observer, the witness. That's you. That's the first you in that original statement we brought up. And in the foreground, there are going to be your thoughts that are always going to show up. The reactive mind. You think that's who you are, but it's not actually true. And that's why, in the opinion of Eastern philosophy, that's why we suffer. Waking up to who you are requires letting go of who you imagine yourself to be. When you begin accepting who you really are, you'll become a lot more comfortable with yourself, comfortable with the present moment. You'll get away from the comparisons and the self-esteem thing, which is just something in your own head of how you compare with others. In the Western world, Einstein said, we're always becoming, we're never being. That means we're always striving for something, which is fine, but as a result, we're oftentimes not comfortable in our own skin. We're always looking forward to the future. And looking forward to the future is usually, I'll be happy then because I'll have enough. But that's going to leave you unhappy with this moment right now. The idea is we have to imagine the future that's going to be great as a life preserver to get us out of this moment that sucks. Now, why does this moment suck? It's because we're looking at it the wrong way. When we imagine the future, we create this dissatisfaction in the present, and someday we're going to be happy, but maybe someday never comes. When we talk about mindfulness and being in the zone and being present, that's the time where the ego leaves. When you're playing the guitar or you're playing sports, you're not having these self-critical thoughts usually because you're in the moment and the ego doesn't have anything to do. It's when we're not in the zone that the ego comes out like the hammer to hammer us. So, how to start dealing with this. 3 steps to try to get over the egoic mind, which is basically overactive thinking. The first thing is just to catch your ego in action. Catch yourself all of the time about to complain. Catch yourself about to one-up somebody's story. Catch yourself feeling bad. Now, if you listen to those thoughts, you're still stuck. But when you begin to label the thoughts and be like, oh, thank you for your advice. I already know what you're saying. You've been saying it forever and it's not helpful. When you begin to minimize your thoughts in that way, you'll be better off. Number 2, if you can start just asking yourself, when you're in this repetitive negative thinking, am I these thoughts or am I only observing the thoughts? When I'm making my grilled cheese sandwich, I don't want to think about the fear I've had for 35 years, but yet, voila, it shows up. Are we able to let it go? As Suzuki Roshi, the Zen master, said, Leave your front door and back door open. Let your thoughts come and go. Just don't serve them tea. Anything you resist as a thought will persist. If you're thinking, don't think this, it's going to keep being thought. But if the thought shows up, the same thought you've always heard, if you can kind of realize ultimately, am I swinging this hammer at myself, or am I being hit by this hammer against my will? Meaning, are you actively trying to introduce this thought? The answer is no. If you're the awareness, the mind is just spewing out, bubbling out these thoughts, and they're the same thoughts. And the final step, try to cultivate or grow the witness. Try to create, through understanding, a little more space between you and your thoughts. As I said, it's going to be really easy to see it in others, how they do this all of the time. And in that way, you get a bit of a superpower. It's a lot harder to see it in yourself. When you begin to catch yourself doing it over time, the thoughts will fall away, meaning it won't happen as often. Kids are way too impatient, and they're like, it doesn't work. You need to keep seeing yourself doing it, and gradually the mindset, the egoic mindset, will fade away. Final slide, Eckhart Tolle, where a lot of this was based upon. The more you identify with your mind, the more you suffer. The more you are able to honor and accept the now, the more you are free of pain, of suffering, and free of the egoic mind. I know today is a heavy-duty concept. Tomorrow we're going to wrap it up, and I'm going to add some quotes from student journals. So hopefully write a journal, and hopefully you got something out of it. Have a great day.